On December 4th, 1642, a man died in Paris who had spent the last 18 years remaking France, and, with it, the entire system of European power. He died in pain, suffering from intestinal tuberculosis, recurring fevers, gout, and migraines that had tormented him for years. Because of his political demands, he was not popular with the people. He was a cardinal of the Roman Catholic Church. He had personally commanded the siege of a Protestant city. He had executed Catholic noblemen who conspired against him. He had allied France with Protestant Sweden and Protestant German princes against the Catholic Habsburg emperor, a contradiction so stark that his enemies called it sacrilege and his admirers called it genius. He was Armand Jean du Plessis de Richelieu, and the world he left behind, a world of sovereign states pursuing national interests without apology, a world where power is organized by intendants and bureaucrats rather than feudal lords, a world where the first minister of a king can be more powerful than any duke or bishop, is essentially the world we still inhabit. This is his story, and it is also inevitably the story of a great question. What does it cost to build a modern state? What do you have to destroy to create something that lasts? And what happens when the man who destroys it is a prince of the church? Armand Jean du Plessis de Richelieu was born on September 9th, 1585, in Paris. Initially destined for a military career, he was forced to enter holy orders in order to preserve for his family the benefit of the bishopric of Lucan. This situation, that his elder brother refused a bishopric, preferring the austere life of a monk, forcing young Armand to abandon his military ambitions and study theology, shaped everything that followed. Attracted by the prospect of becoming a bishop, he began theological studies in 1605 and obtained his doctorate from the Sorbonne in 1607. He was named Bishop of Lucan by King Henri IV, and on April 17, 1607, he received canonical investiture from the Cardinal de Givry. Without being a fervent pietist, he was nonetheless a bishop attached to his duties. Lucan was one of the poorest and most neglected dioceses in France. He distinguished himself as a Catholic reformer, notably by implementing the institutional reforms that the Council of Trent had established between 1545 and 1563, becoming, in fact, the first bishop in France to execute them. Here was a man who had the temperament of a general and the intelligence of a philosopher, spending his energy on church administration and diocesan reform while the great events of France unfolded around him. Richelieu began his political career by being elected deputy of the Poitevin clergy to the Estates General of Paris in August 1614, where he became spokesman of the Assembly. He was 30 years old, impossibly young for such a role, and he made an impression that those who saw him would not quickly forget. What followed was a decade of maneuvering, setback, and patient rehabilitation. He entered the service of the Queen Mother, Marie de Medici, who was acting as regent for the young Louis XIII. He served briefly as Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs in 1616, then was dismissed when his patron fell from favor. He endured years of eclipse, convinced that the latent war opposing the king and his mother was ruining all hope of stability for the kingdom. He worked to bring the two camps together. A skilled diplomat, he was the architect of several treaties ending the wars of mother and son, earning him sufficient esteem to receive his cardinal's hat in 1622. A living symbol of the fragile reconciliation between Marie and Louis, he rejoined the King's Council in 1624 before becoming its first minister a few months later. He was 38 years old. He had spent nearly 2 decades maneuvering from a remote diocese to the center of French power. And now, finally in position, he announced his program with the clarity of a man who had been thinking about it for years. In 1624, Richelieu proposed to the king 3 objectives: to weaken the power of the nobility, to reduce the Habsburg power of Austria, and to diminish the power of Protestantism in France, for both political reasons and Christian unity. These 3 objectives were not separate policies. They were a single, integrated vision of what France had to become if it was to survive and prevail. And the logic connecting them was the concept that would define Richelieu's entire career, la raison d'etat, the reason of state. The idea is simple to state and endlessly difficult to live with. A state has interests that are distinct from, and sometimes opposed to, the interests of any individual, including the interests of morality as conventionally understood. What serves the survival and power of the state is raison d'etat, regardless of whether it is kind or pious or honest or consistent with the professed beliefs of those who exercise it. Richelieu incarnates the reason of state in its purest form. He was able to subordinate ideological passions to a long-term strategic vision aimed at weakening Habsburg hegemony and strengthening France as a European power. For a cardinal of the Roman Catholic Church, to make this his governing philosophy was, to say the very least, controversial. It meant being willing to ally with Protestant princes against Catholic ones. It meant executing Catholic nobles who served French interests less than they served their own. It meant treating religion as a tool of policy rather than as the foundation on which policy rested. This was not cynicism, exactly. Richelieu was a man of genuine faith, or so the evidence suggests. But his faith was separated with surgical precision from his governance. He had decided that France could only be saved by a particular kind of power, and that this power required him to do things that no amount of piety could justify within any conventional religious framework. The consequences of this decision were to be felt in every domain of French life. The first domestic obstacle Richelieu had to remove was the political and military power of the Huguenots, the French Protestants who, following the Edict of Nantes granted by Henri IV in 1598, possessed not merely the right of worship, but something far more dangerous to a centralizing state: fortified cities, separate assemblies, and their own military organization. In 1625, Richelieu addressed the king in his council to warn him. It is certain that as long as the Huguenot party subsists in France, the king will not be absolute in his kingdom. The Protestants of France form a state within the state. They have their political assemblies, a territorial organization, and their military strongholds. Their metropolis is the city of La Rochelle, which for half a century has effectively freed itself from royal authority. The distinction Richelieu made was crucial, and it reveals the precise nature of his raison d'etat. If he tolerated the freedom of worship accorded to the Huguenots, he fought against their political military organization, which constituted a state within the state. He was not, in principle, a religious persecutor. He was a centralizer. The problem was not that the Huguenots prayed differently. The problem was that they governed separately. The siege of La Rochelle, which Richelieu personally commanded between 1627 and 1628, was the most dramatic and most revealing episode of his domestic policy. After a blockade of 13 months, the rebellious Protestant city capitulated, losing its military privileges while preserving its religious freedom. The death toll: approximately 19,000 Rochellais perished, most from famine. To impose the blockade, a sea dike of 1,500 meters was constructed around the city, cutting it off completely from potential reinforcements. England, under the Duke of Buckingham, attempted twice to relieve the city and failed both times. Richelieu had organized, for the first time, something approaching a genuine French navy. He had demonstrated that the crown could project force to any point in its territory. The Peace of Alès in 1629 that followed the fall of La Rochelle preserved the freedom of Protestant worship, but abolished every political and military privilege the Huguenots had enjoyed. A state within the state was no more. If the Huguenots represented one challenge to royal authority, the great nobility represented another, and in some ways a more ancient and more deeply rooted one. For centuries, the great dukes and marquises of France had governed their territories with a degree of autonomy that was, in practice, sovereignty. They raised their own armies, administered their own justice, collected their own revenues, and conspired against the crown when it suited them. Facing the turbulent nobility that defied royal power, Richelieu suppressed the high offices occupied by nobles and had more than 2,000 chateaux and fortresses razed, judged unnecessary for the defense of the kingdom. He also gave greater power to the intendants, charged with applying royal ordinances in the provinces. He suppressed provincial assemblies. He institutionalized the police, justice, and finances. He had certain nobles who showed hostility to his policies beheaded. Finally, he made duels illegal, a practice greatly favored by the nobility of the time. The duel prohibition deserves particular attention because it illustrates Richelieu's method perfectly. The duel was not merely a social custom. It was a statement of principle, that the nobleman's honor was his own affair to be settled by his own sword outside the jurisdiction of any court. To ban the duel was to assert that no man, however noble, was above the king's law. It was paradoxically this ban on duels that gave Alexandre Dumas the idea for the Three Musketeers, the novel in which Richelieu appears as the great villain, the cold spider at the center of power's web. The executions were real and they were calculated. The Duke of Montmorency, one of the greatest nobles in France, governor of Languedoc, scion of a family that had served French kings for generations, was caught conspiring and was beheaded in 1632. The message was unmistakable. No birth, no title, no family tradition of service could protect you if you chose to make yourself an obstacle to the royal will as Richelieu interpreted it. But the most enduring institutional innovation was the system of intendants. Richelieu advanced the use of intendants, royal commissioners sent into the provinces to enforce royal law, supervise tax collection, and weaken the independent power of provincial nobles and courts. He worked to curb private armies and illegal fortifications, and to professionalize and centralize administrative and judicial machinery. The intendants were, in effect, the prototype of the modern civil servant, professionals appointed by and answerable to the central power, with authority over taxation, justice, and police in their assigned regions. They were not nobles governing by hereditary right. They were functionaries governing by royal appointment. They could be dismissed. They could be replaced. They owed everything to the crown and nothing to local tradition or local power. This system, refined, extended, and eventually made permanent, is the ancestor of the French administrative structure that still exists today. The prefects who govern French departments, the centralized authority of Paris over provincial administration, the tradition of the state as the organizing principle of French life. Richelieu built the scaffolding on which all of this rests. If Richelieu's domestic policy was ruthless, his foreign policy was something more. It was the most audacious strategic gamble of the 17th century, executed by a man who did not live to see its conclusion. The backdrop was the 30 Years' War, which had begun in 1618 with a spectacular act of defiance. Bohemian Protestant nobles had thrown the representatives of the Habsburg Emperor out of a window of the Prague castle, the defenestration of Prague, and declared an independent Bohemian state under a Protestant king. The Habsburgs crushed this revolt with devastating efficiency and proceeded to use their victory as a platform for attempting to impose Catholic orthodoxy across the German states they controlled. The Habsburgs had succeeded, through a fortunate patrimonial policy, in gathering under their control a large number of European states: Austria, Bohemia, Spain, Milan, Naples, the Netherlands, Portugal. In the name of militant Catholicism, they sought to establish their authority in Germany and reduce the Protestant states during the 30 Years' War. For France, this was a catastrophic geopolitical prospect. A Habsburg Empire that stretched from Spain through Italy, across the Alps to Austria, Bohemia, and the German states. Controlling the Netherlands to the north, France would be encircled, hemmed in on every side by a single dynasty. Whatever Richelieu believed as a cardinal, as France's chief minister, he could not allow this. His solution was the most spectacular illustration of raison d'etat in history. France financed Holland and Sweden, Protestant powers at war against the Habsburgs. A Catholic cardinal funding Protestant armies to fight a Catholic emperor. This policy is not without contradictions. Richelieu, cardinal of the Catholic Church and a pitiless adversary of centrifugal forces, particularly Protestant ones, inside the kingdom, allied himself with foreign Protestants against the Habsburgs, champions of Catholicism. Religious considerations thus opposed political ones. His enemies screamed treason against the faith. Richelieu was unmoved. The security of France was not a religious question. It was a political one. And the political reality was that the Habsburgs, if unchecked, would render France permanently subordinate. He funded the Protestant Danes when they entered the war, then shifted support to Gustavus Adolphus of Sweden when the Danes were defeated. The Swedish king whose army swept through Germany and changed the balance of the war entirely, until his death at the Battle of Lutzen in 1632. And when Swedish momentum faltered and the Habsburgs began to recover, Richelieu took the decisive step. In 1635, France entered the war directly. The immediate objectives of Cardinal Richelieu, who directed the policy of Louis XIII, were to take Alsace from the Holy Empire and to weaken the position of the Spanish Habsburgs in Holland and Italy. The French entry transformed the war. It was no longer a German religious conflict with external participants. It was now, unmistakably, a contest between the House of Bourbon and the House of Habsburg for the mastery of Europe, which is what, in Richelieu's analysis, it had always really been. The year 1630 produced the most dramatic moment in Richelieu's career, the moment that tested whether he would survive at all. Marie de Medici, the queen mother who had originally brought Richelieu to power, had turned against him. She objected above all to his policy of allying with Protestant powers, which she found morally indefensible. She summoned Louis XIII and, believing she had his confidence, demanded that the cardinal be dismissed. Louis XIII renewed his confidence in Richelieu, sent his mother into exile, and suppressed the opposition and the nobility. The day became known as the Journée de Dupes, the Day of Dupes. Those who had believed they were about to see Richelieu fall discovered that they were the ones who had been deceived. The Queen Mother spent the rest of her life in exile, dying in Cologne in 1642, the same year as the minister who had outlasted her. The lesson was clear. Louis XIII and Richelieu were not merely king and minister. They were, in some essential way, a single political entity, each providing what the other lacked. Louis was not a weak king. He was a man of genuine intelligence and genuine will. But he suffered from chronic illness, from a temperament that was melancholic and indecisive under pressure, and from the constant pressure of a court full of ambitious figures who sensed his vulnerabilities. Richelieu provided what Louis needed: clarity of purpose, ruthlessness of execution, and the willingness to be hated so that the king did not have to be. The minister had obtained not only the king's ear, but also his confidence. He would define the bases of royal absolutism around three great principles: eradicate Protestantism as a political force in France, reduce the House of Austria, and overthrow the power of the nobility. This relationship, the cold, brilliant minister and the complex, often reluctant king, is one of the most consequential partnerships in the history of statecraft. It produced France's transformation from a war-torn, nobly fractured, religiously divided kingdom into something recognizably modern. A centralized state with a professional administration, a genuine foreign policy, and an uncontested internal authority. There is an aspect of Richelieu that appears to not fit easily into the portrait of the cold calculator of power: his genuine commitment to culture and learning. Richelieu is also famous for the support he brings to the arts. The best-known fact is the founding of the Académie française, the society responsible for questions concerning the French language. The Académie française, founded in 1635, was charged with producing a definitive dictionary of the French language and establishing standards of usage, grammar, and style. It still exists. It still publishes its dictionary. Its 40 seats, the immortals, as the members are called, are still among the most coveted honors in French intellectual life. Richelieu created it in 1635 in the midst of wars, executions, and diplomatic maneuvers, because he understood something about power that purely military thinkers miss. That a nation that speaks with one voice, in one language, by one shared set of cultural standards, is stronger than a nation that does not. The standardization of French was, in this sense, the cultural analog of the intendants, a mechanism for imposing coherent central authority over the magnificent but anarchic diversity of France's regional traditions. Richelieu understood that absolutism required not merely political centralization, but cultural homogenization. He also patronized literature, supported the theater, and surrounded himself with intellectuals and artists. This combination, the cardinal who executed nobles and funded poets, who waged wars across Europe and established a language academy, is part of what makes him so difficult to reduce to a single moral verdict. He was not a barbarian. He was a man of genuine cultivation who believed that civilization required, at its foundation, a ruthlessness that civilization preferred not to acknowledge. The war that Richelieu shaped, and in which France directly participated from 1635, was the most destructive conflict Europe had experienced since the Black Death. Estimates of the total dead, from battle, from plague, from famine, from the economic collapse that followed in the army's wake, range between 5 and 8 million people across the German lands. Entire regions were depopulated. Cities that had been prosperous in 1618 were smoking ruins by 1648. The population of the Holy Roman Empire declined by perhaps a third. The war produced atrocities on every side, perpetrated by armies that were frequently not paid, frequently not supplied, and therefore frequently sustained by systematic violence against civilian populations. Richelieu did not start this war. He entered it when he judged that France's strategic interests required entry, and he organized France's participation with the cold professionalism of a man who understood war as an instrument of policy rather than as a moral adventure. He recruited, equipped, and provisioned armies at a scale France had never previously attempted. He built the administrative infrastructure that could sustain a prolonged military effort. He negotiated the alliances that kept France from fighting alone. But the price was enormous. The bellicose spirit with which the First Minister conducted foreign affairs involved France in costly wars. And those wars were paid for by taxes that fell primarily on the poorest subjects of the kingdom, the peasants who had no political voice and no means of resistance. The very intendants that Richelieu created to modernize French administration became, after 1635, the instruments of an intensifying fiscal pressure that generated misery, rebellion, and bitter resentment. The modern state was paid for, in part, by crushing the people it governed. Richelieu died on December 4th, 1642, 6 years before the Treaty of Westphalia that concluded the 30 Years' War and codified the European order he had worked to create. He did not see his victory, but the peace that was made reflected his strategic vision with remarkable fidelity. The organizational genius of Richelieu and of Cardinal Mazarin, who succeeded him in 1643, ultimately achieved victory for France and its allies. The treaty accomplished everything Richelieu had set out to accomplish. The 30 Years' War marked the end of Habsburg predominance. France received territories in Alsace and strategic positions that strengthened its eastern frontier. The German principalities received confirmed autonomy from the emperor, fragmenting the potential Habsburg bloc. The principle of sovereignty, the idea that each state is supreme within its own territory and that no external authority, whether imperial or papal, can override that supremacy, was recognized as the organizing principle of the European order. The consequences of the 30 Years' War led to the emergence of the concept of reason of state, in which national interests take precedence. This system persisted until the upheavals of the French Revolution. This is Richelieu's true legacy. Not any particular territorial gain, not any specific institutional reform, but the intellectual framework that made possible the modern international system. The Westphalian system of sovereign states pursuing national interests, constrained only by the balance of power and formal treaty obligations, is a system that has governed international relations in its essentials from 1648 to the present. Its limitations are real, and its history is written in wars and catastrophes. But it was Richelieu who, more than any other single figure, gave it its theoretical and practical foundation. Richelieu anticipates the principles of the balance of power that will become central to European politics. He is seen as a precursor of political realism, capable of understanding that the security of the state depends on the ability to manipulate international dynamics. How we judge Richelieu? The question is genuinely difficult, and the difficulty is part of what makes him so important to think about. He was ruthless. He used espionage, censorship, and execution as routine instruments of policy. He censored the press, established a large network of internal spies, forbade the discussion of political matters in public assemblies, and had those who dared to conspire against him prosecuted and executed. People died, some of them guilty, some of them innocent, all of them victims of a political logic that treated the state's interests as the supreme value. But Richelieu lived in a time when brutal instruments were utilized more frequently to serve the government's policy. With the lenses of 17th century Europe, it was hardly an exceptional thing. He was also, in a different register, genuinely constructive. He left France stronger, better administered, more culturally coherent, and more powerful in European affairs than he found it. The institutions he built, the intendants, the Académie française, the professionalized army, the foreign ministry, were not merely instruments of his personal power. They were durable contributions to the development of the modern state. And the paradox at the center of his career, the Catholic cardinal who allied with Protestants, the churchman who governed by reason of state, the man of faith who practiced a politics from which faith was not in a place of honor, is not a contradiction to be resolved. That would be so hard to do, but a tension that existed. It reveals something permanent about the gap between the world as we believe it ought to be governed and the world as it actually must be governed if it is to be governed at all. At the announcement of his death, some people reportedly lit bonfires of joy. But Cardinal Mazarin, his successor, continued his policies with sufficient skill that, within 6 years of Richelieu's death, the Treaty of Westphalia had ratified his strategic vision in every essential respect. The bonfires of celebration were extinguished. The system endured. What Richelieu invented, or rather, what he named and implemented with unprecedented ruthlessness and clarity, is similar to what we call power politics. The pursuit of state interest by any means available, the subordination of morality to strategy, the calculation of advantage that defines the permanent substructure of international relations beneath the formal rituals of diplomacy. He did not invent human nature. States had always pursued power, but he was the first great statesman to theorize this pursuit explicitly, to build institutions around it, and to demonstrate, with brutal efficiency, what it could accomplish. The world he left behind is recognizably ours. Whether that is a judgment in his favor or against him is a question each generation must answer for itself. Armand Jean du Plessis de Richelieu was buried in the Church of the Sorbonne, which he had rebuilt and endowed. His effigy lies there still, the cardinal in his robes, his face calm, his expression revealing nothing. Around him, the France he built went on to achieve the absolute monarchy of Louis XIV, the Enlightenment, the revolutionary upheaval of 1789, and the long, complex, still unresolved negotiation between state power and individual freedom, one of the defining traits of French experience. He paid for what he built with his health. Those fevers and migraines and intestinal crises that tormented his last decade. He put his soul on the line, as a man of faith who decided to govern by interests rather than by conscience. He paid for it with his reputation, despised by those he governed and misrepresented by the novelist who made him the villain of the most beloved adventure story in French literature. But the building stood, and the system he invented, the state that serves no interest but its own, governed by professionals responsible only to the central authority, projecting power abroad without apology and organizing its internal life without sentiment, is the system that has governed the modern world for better and for worse ever since. La raison d'État, the reason of state, Richelieu's gift to posterity and his burden. Thanks for watching. See you next time with another human story